Hello, I'm Brian Mulligan. I'm here to show you how this Autodesk Connectfx graphics template that you downloaded was built and put together so that you can customize it for your own needs. Let's take a look at this one. Alright, so this dynamic slashes graphics template is basically built with actual multiple timeline layers. Each layer basically transitions over the next, giving you a nice fluid and complex graphics feel. With this graphics template, you're free to change the video and the type to create the kind of message that you want. So as you can see, there's 8 video layers to this effect. Each layer basically builds on top of the other one as the effects progress. Let's just take a look at the first one right now. You can see with the first one that you've got your images, some matte panels, lens flares, and 3D text that pop up. As it approaches the second clip basically wipes on top of the first, creating more slashes and more 3D text. Above this layer, I've actually put the lens flares separately to show you how they can key on top just as video layers. As you progress up, more and more layers are added, each layer with a similar but different graphic feel. Let's take a look at these one at a time. In this first layer, it's just a Connectfx segment built upon a gap, so there's not even an actual video clip here to begin with. Let's just enter in Connectfx. And here, you've got a fairly elaborate Connectfx setup, but it's really broken down into 3 sections. This section here, this middle section, and then the top section. Let's take a look at them separately. Let's hide our media library to give us a little bit more room. Let's go to a 2-up view so we can see our effects in context with our shot. This first section up here is basically our background, this brushed aluminum texture. Now, it's silver to begin with. I put it through a 2D transform to get basically 45-degree lines from the original pattern. From there, I use a garbage mask to create a matte reveal to bring it on. There's another garbage mask being used to create a different matte transition. This one I actually put through a negative node to reverse the effect. These are all being fed into media layers of an action setup. So all of this happens inside of action. This middle section here is where you can swap out your video clip. You'll notice there are notes available in the Connectfx schematic. If you double click on them, they will give you information. This one says drag and drop new media on this clip to change the video. So if you open up your media library again, you can feel free to choose a different video clip of your own and simply drag and drop it over the existing video clip to change it. Now this video clip will pass through the pipeline until it reaches the end in our main action scene. If we scroll through, you can see how the video is updated inside all the effects. Let's undo this to get back to our original image. Let's hide our media library again to give us more room so we can explore the rest of this schematic. Our video clip is fed into a mux layer and into a gmask layer. This mux layer is really just an organizational tool because the output of this mux is going to several media inputs of action. Having this as a mux tool here allows me to easily break this connection. I can pipe in a new piece of media just into the mux node. Then I don't have to remake all of the other connections. So the mux node is really nice when you're actually working and designing an effect such as this, because it gives you the freedom to try new things. I'm simply going to reconnect this back to get back to where we were. Now the mux node is simply feeding this clip into several video layers. The mattes for these video layers are being controlled from this garbage mask. This Gmask node has an animation built that sort of creates this diagonal slash. You'll notice that it, too, is also feeding into some mux nodes of its own. Now, these mux nodes aren't being used necessarily for organization in this case, but for timing. If you double-click on a mux node, you can see that it has a timing offset. So what's happening here is that this garbage mask is being animated, starting at frame 2 and ending at frame 21. When it feeds into this mux node, the mux node is actually separating the timing here minus 7 frames. So you can see that this animation now begins at frame 9 instead of frame 2, which is 7 frames back from the original timing. This mux node here has a timing offset of 12, so this same wipe effect doesn't happen until later. So I'm able to use one effect that I know I'm going to use repeatedly and offset it in time just using these mux nodes and the timing offset. So not only can mux nodes be used for organization, but they can be used to offset elements in time. You can also see that this garbage mask is being fed into another Gmask, whereas this Gmask is creating these cascading of boxes that travel across the screen, just as a design element. That's being fed into this bump displace node, including the video, to kind of give it this glassy panel effect. Once again, these are all being fed into this action setup, and we'll see how those media layers are being composited together. This section down here is an action node being used for our 3D type. If you double-click the note, you'll see it says change the 3D text within this action node. You can choose your own fonts if desired. Also, this action node has the same brushed aluminum texture being fed into it. We're using that to actually texture the type. If you'd like to change the type, double-click on the action node, look at the action schematic, and you can see that you have 2 geometry nodes set up. Double-clicking the geometry nodes will bring us to the 3D text menu. You can see that this one says experience with some space and future. This other one just says the in a different typeface, a thinner typeface. Now, I could have used 3 geometry nodes and created 3 different words, and that would have worked the same, but I was just economizing things by using 1 node and putting spaces in the lettering. Either one is acceptable. If you want to change the text, simply delete the characters and type your own. Everything will update. You may have to adjust the position of your other text just to balance it out. These other lights are here in the scene to give the text the look that it has. With the highlights, our brushed aluminum texture is being used as diffuse maps to texture the text to give it a certain look. You can change this diffuse map as well just by going out into action, by placing a new video clip or still image over this clip, and it will automatically map onto your text. So this action setup has 2 outputs to it, one being the video, the other one being the matte output. We're taking this 3D type, once again, putting it through some mux nodes and some Gmasks to break it up and create different animations. This Gmask, for example, does a wipe to reveal the text. The mux nodes, in this case, are actually being used to just freeze the image because there's no animation to this text. By freezing the image from this action only has to render 1 frame out of the text. The mux node will basically cache that 1 frame, so action doesn't have to keep generating frames for the rest of the effect. The same thing is done with the matte. The effect is frozen to just 1 frame. The mat is now being fed into this garbage mask node with some animations to create a couple of reveals for the text. Again, some more mux nodes are placed here, but the timing is being offset. The effect that happens for this also goes through some mux nodes with the timing offset. Now these are also being fed into action in media layers. So what you're really looking at in this main scene, and by looking at the action schematic, are several elements. You've got our background plate that wipes on. Then the other images are being revealed with our matte slashes and other effects. By looking at any one of these images, say image 2 in our media list, you can see it's being fed by this mux53 node, which basically has our background image and our wipe. This entire image also has a blurred video front, seen here in the blur fields, so that you can adjust how clear these wipe edges become. Now this inner portion is up here. If I hide this node, you can see where it's just being overlaid on top of the other image. If you look at the object panel, you can see that basically there's a blend mode here for this object. I could change the blend node to maybe an overlay to create a different look, possibly screen. Or you can use Photoshop blend modes, such as Vivid Light, or even Multiply. Many of these blend modes don't work for this effect, but you're free to experiment for what works for you and your video. Set this back to normal. Now the action schematic gives you a visual representation of your elements, but not necessarily what's happening on a layer by layer basis. This can get confusing when you're coming from other layer-based compositing programs. To show you how your clips are actually being layered, go to the Priority tab. From here, you can scroll down and start to see how the images stack up. You've got our background image. Image 3 is our wider matte underneath. And if we look at the blend mode, you can see that it's in soft light. If I hide it, you can see what it's actually doing. Going back to the priority mode, image 2, you can see highlighted in your scene, and that's the one that has this out of focus edging to it. And then image 5 is being composited on top, here, on top of that layer. So it just creates what looks like blurry edges. Image 6. So image 6 is basically our background again, masking on top as a letterbox effect to kind of crop the image. If I hide it, you can see how these slashes go full screen. As we scroll up, there are a few other panels here that haven't quite revealed themselves based on the timing of the mux nodes outside in Connectfx and based upon the timing of the Gmask animations that are associated with them. As we progress along in this effect, you can see that our panels come through from our garbage mask. More wipes happen to reveal our backgrounds. Here, you can see these images start displaying in the tile, as well as down here in the priority editor. Our type is being revealed. And this element here, this bar that it sits on, is actually a 3D element right here. This 3D geometry is actually just a dash from the Arial bold font. It's stretched out and animated across. There's also some shear being added to give it that angled look that matches the rest of the design. This bar also is being textured with a reflection texture of our same scene. You can go into the controls for it and adjust the effect to make it brighter or dimmer based upon how your video reacts. As we exit back out to our Connectfx setup, you can see that out of one action, everything feeds into the second action, which is being used to add a lens flare. By looking at the note, it basically says the lens flare is inside this action. If we double click on the action, look at the schematic, you can see that there's just a simple lens flare. Now, why did I build this outside in this action? Why didn't I put the lens flare inside here with the main scene? Well, to be honest, I was creating this and building it and didn't know I wanted the lens flare at the time. If you look inside the main action, I have lights set up for the scene, lighting various individual images. Once I would have added a lens flare, it would have altered the lighting because a new light would have been added, and I would have had to have made adjustments. By doing a lens flare external to action, I can keep my original lighting as is, and just supplement it with a lens flare on top of the entire scene. There's no right or wrong way to do it. It's just how I was working through the process in designing this effect. So this is one panel and how it's built. Let's exit back out of Connectfx and back to the timeline. So back here in the timeline, we have our first element. I started to use pieces and parts from this element into another Connectfx and started layering my scenes up. This Connectfx here, if we jump up to it, actually will reveal on top of the other one. If we go inside the setup, you can see our Connectfx schematic here. There's one main action comp where everything is fed into, just like the other one. But you also notice that this action comp is using a back clip. And this back clip is actually the clip we just did on the timeline. So it's actually using the clip from the timeline in this effect on the next layer. The back clip is very handy to be able to layer effects because this entire effect will actually see through what's below it and then use it in the composition. If we look at what's feeding this action, you can see that once again, we have a video clip. If I open up the media library, you can take your own video, simply drag and drop it, and everything about the effect will update using this video clip. Let me undo to get back to what we had. I'll hide my media library again, and we'll go up to 2-up view. Now I have this Indy Skyline clip with a note attached. If we look at this note, it basically says to drag and drop your clip to change the video, and it also says note that this color correct node is added to adjust for this clip. You can reset it or remove it as needed based on your own video. You can see that this clip is a little washed out. So I've run it through a color corrector to stylize it a bit more. That simply feeds into an action media layer. The matte for this clip also is being fed into a garbage mask, which is doing a reveal. That also simply feeds into an action media layer. Down here, we have our brushed aluminum texture again with our 2D transform to get our 45-degree angles, and that's simply fed into an action media layer. I'm actually using the color corrector inside of action to invert it and make it darker. Once again, down here, we have an action for 3D type. A texture map being fed into this action layer, texturing our type. Inside of this action, you can look at the schematic. It too has the same 2 nodes of text. This type also has some animation from it, character axis animation, that causes it to rotate and reveal with a little cascading effect. This is all controlled here in the animation. The result of this action gets fed into some mux nodes for both the video and the matte. There's an offset timing here of -53 frames, so the effect actually doesn't start until frame 53, even though in the original action it starts at the beginning. Now I did this simply because I had this set up and easily to be able to time the speed of the animation starting from 0 in action, and honestly I didn't know where I wanted it to start as I was developing this into the main action scene. I had these other elements happening first, before the text revealed on. And it was just easier to add a mux node and offset the timing there. This green line is a mimic link, so that if I change the timing on one node, the timing changes on the other. So I only have to change one thing for both the video and the alpha. You can see that this then feeds into several action media layers, because I start doing some stylization on this type, adding glows and light effects to it. You can see that out of this mux node, I run it through a Gmask node that does several little wipes to reveal different parts of the text. Another Gmask node does the same thing, but slightly differently. So I have all that running into a blur node, giving it a little RGB offsets. Once all of this gets fed into action, you can go inside your action schematic and see your nodes. Once again, everything here sort of has an object orientation. And if you want to look at the layer priority of how everything's being built, go to the priority menu, and you can see how things are going to animate up. You can see the effect initially wipes on and reveals. Then these slashes come in. Now these slashes are simply 3D text geometries. If I double click them, it opens up the 3D text menuing. This is just the discrete bold font with the standard backslash. I actually have it sheared and skewed and stretched a little bit to make it as large as I need it. There's a little bit of a bevel added to it, so I can get this refraction effect on the edges. Now part of the reason this works is because I'm using a reflection map of the same scene. So via this reflection map and its axis, I can actually scale the image inside and reposition it however I like to sort of get that glassy reflection look that I want. There's a light being generated that's pointing just to this object, so I can highlight it just the way I want. There's a light that's illuminating just this object, so that I can take it and light it just the way I want. There's a few of these other slashes that animate on. This one's a little thinner. So as those slashes go through, eventually our text that we have comes in. Its animation, again, another 3D text bar for it to sit on. It too's using a reflection map, and this time some blur has been added. There's a light that actually lights these two objects that passes across the screen as a little highlight. You can see it here. Later on in our schematic, you can see that our text effects with our Gmasks revealing just certain letters are popping through. The blend mode for this image is on add to really make the highlights pop up. You can also adjust the transparency of this to dial it in just as you would want. As our effect progresses, you can see that we get our other elements, these blurred streaks coming through. The really strong ones are seen here in image 6. I can hide, and you can see what they're doing. There's quite a bit of blur in the Y value for these. Now, these 3 axis nodes are here, and as they connect, they basically duplicate and double and triple up this one image. If we look at the blend mode for it, you can see that it too is in add mode. But if I disconnect these axis effects, you can see that the initial one isn't very bright, even in add mode. So by just simply adding another axis and connecting it, this image actually gets duplicated so that it appears more than one time. By adding a third, I'm now adding 3 layers because I needed this certain amount of brightness. So there's no need for me to actually duplicate this one image. I can just duplicate axes and connect it to it, creating basically an instance of this one image. So we look back through our effect. As it progresses on, our effects happen, but it's still missing a little something, possibly a lens flare. We exit back out to our action scene. You can see that there is no lens flare node in the schematic. I chose to actually just do that on the timeline. So that on the timeline, this Connectfx node right above it simply adds the lens flare. There's nothing fancy about this Connectfx node. If I go into the editor, once again, it uses the back clip. And inside the action node, there's just two simple lens flares. If you look at them, you can see how they reveal on and animate, simply just keying over the back clip. Going back to the timeline, so back on the timeline, I used some more Connectfx setups as adjustment segments that look to the layer below to build up this scene. By looking at this layer above it now, you can see that I've added several of these same 3D slashes that will animate over the top of the scene. So one of the great things about working this way is that you can use these timeline Connectfx segments that are looking through to the back clip and mix and match them over different scenes. If I wanted these same slashes to create this reflection-refraction effect onto another element, I could do that simply by taking the element, copying it up, and placing it on top of another scene. In this case, here's our hard commit layer. I've dropped this effect on top, but now I can add even more of these dynamic slashes into the effect. So using these elements on the timeline, being layered up this way, is really, really powerful. So once again, by looking at some of these other effects, going to Connectfx in the editor, they're basically built the same way. Now this Connectfx schematic is much simpler. If we go to 2-up view, you can see we have our action set up, which is using one video clip, our brushed aluminum texture again, and another 3D text action node for our text creation. If we go into our action schematic and look at our diffuse layer, you can see that the effect has been dialed down all the way to 19. If I bring it back up, you can see that our silver texture returns. This then all feeds into this main action comp. The reveal for our media actually happens inside of action this time, instead of in an external Gmask, simply using the keyer inside of action with a Gmask keyer. If we look at the result, you can see that we have our angled slash reveal. Could have done the same thing externally in Connectfx, but as you're designing and working, you end up using the tools wherever you're at. Action has a great keyer with masking ability, so why not use it here? And once again, you can look at the priority layer to see how things are being layered up. Our background video, our texture background clip for this slash right here, and 3D objects for our slashes. Inside of action, you can see that our slashes are once again these 3D text geometries, discrete bold with our forward slash. A reflection map being used to create our reflection and refraction effect. Some additional lights are being added in the scene to give it some flair and some highlights. This bar that the text is sitting on is just another forward slash of the same font. The reflection map here is softened and blurred with a value of 3. There's also a lens flare added into this scene. So going back to the timeline, the rest of these effects are sort of built using the basis of the ones we've already looked at. The second effect here does a similar wipe, but I've reversed all the angles. So this effect is similar to one of our earlier ones, where we wipe on, create our 3D text, add our slashes, our text highlights, more slashes, change of background, and some lens flares. By looking at these elements, I chose to add these slashes once again, just on top of the layer below. And in this case, one more time. Looking inside this effect again, going into Connectfx, it's just a simple back clip being fed into some 3D geometries that are actually just 3D text, discrete bold, forward slash. Looking back at our media library, other elements to this template includes a lower third that animates on, and another panel that you can use for titling. So thanks for checking out this Connectfx graphics template for Autodesk Smoke.